So in this last section, we're going to look at some of the tools that we can use for planning. I'm not going to get super bogged down in it though, because I think a lot of the tools that they cover in the book aren't going to be directly relevant to you in the music industry. But what I'm going to try and do is offer some ways that you can use them to help inform you about some of the ways that you might be engaged in planning, and how some of the principles that come from these tools might be useful to you. And so again, the book has this very corporate, big organizational approach, where it talks about how traditionally planning is done by the top levels of management. And what you might see in these large, big global organizations is an actual formal planning department. I've never worked in an organisation where that exists. I have worked in some big government departments and universities, and sometimes they have areas that do with planning, but it tends to be more in kind of construction and those kinds of big projects that have specific timelines and where there's a lot of moving parts that need to be coordinated, that tends to involve formal planning. And I would say that in most cases, in the work that you'll be doing in the music industry, you're not going to be working with a formal planning department, but you may be working with suppliers that have that more formal approach. So say if you're working with any contractors that are in like production. So for example, in my events background, we used to work with people like Harry the Hirer, and they would have a lot of tools that they use for planning because they need to manage all the different bits of equipment that the AV equipment, any of the staging equipment. And so they need to know when that piece of equipment is going to be available and book it in, and then have a timeline around bump ins and bump outs so that they can do their staffing. And so you may be working with suppliers or contractors who are going to be much more involved in that very fine grain approach to planning. And so being aware of that is really helpful in you doing your job well and also helping them do their jobs well. So some of the tools that that the book covers are, first of all, a Gantt chart. So some of you may have seen this in the past. Very simply, a Gantt chart is a timeline management tool. And so typically what you would see here in terms of months would be the actual names. So you might see January, February, March, April. And the idea here is that you've got a list of all the tasks down the side. And the goal, ideally, how long is that going to take? So in this case, we're saying that editing our book, let's say this is a book manuscript, a book that they're producing. So they're going to be editing that manuscript for the month of January. And they're going to be designing some of the artwork for some of the sample pages, starting about mid-January and running through to the end of February. And then what we see here is where we're actually tracking in green the actual progress. So what we can see here is that they finished this task a little bit early, so before January. And so this gives us the ability to monitor and track the progress of these tasks over time, and to see where things are taking longer than they should be. So say if this is April, if we're at the end of April, we've got a good snapshot now of where we are in terms of this project. We can see the tasks that have been completed because they've stopped. But we can see here that this gallery proofs action item is running over time and is still not finished if we're at this point. And so this helps us to be able to monitor and manage the actual projects that we're developing. So say this would be useful in, say, something like a festival where you've got a lot of forward planning. You might be trying to lock in your production requirements. You might be trying to lock in your acts. You might be trying to lock in what your site plan is going to look like, what your staffing is going to need, or your ordering of supplies such as your food and alcohol. All these things you might come up with some kind of schedule for, and a Gantt chart might be something you would use for that purpose. Similarly, if you're a record label, you might have a Gantt chart that maps the release. So you might start to pop in things like the recording, when the recording is going to be done, when the mastering will be done, when pressing or uploading would be done, and then when you're going to do, you know, commence your tour, etc., etc., so that you can start to map out over time when all these different activities would happen. A load chart is a similar sort of thing to a Gantt chart, except that instead of looking at tasks, we're looking at people. So this might be the case, say, maybe like an A&R department, if they're working with a roster of acts, you might start to map out all the people in the A&R department and their workload over those different months. So again, if one is January to February, etc., etc., we might have Kerry who's looking after a stable of acts, and they're really busy in those months because they're putting out releases and they're doing summer tours and blah, 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 blah. But then come March, those tours are all over, those releases are all done, and things are quietening down for Kerry. But as you can see, Chris is pretty chockers right through to the end of June. Whereas Mark is having a pretty chilled summer with not much happening, but then it's starting to pick up as autumn through to winter comes. And so this, as a manager, might help you to be able to identify who's busy and who isn't. And so then if you sign a new act, you might say, well, Mark's looking pretty light on, so let's give this act to Mark. Obviously, depending on if that's Mark's area, but it might help you to be able to plan who is doing what. And you can think of this as a bit of a roster kind of approach as well. We then have PERT networks, which are, look, we'll dig into them, but I'd be surprised if any of you kind of ever need to use them. But let's just be aware of them in case you start to think of how you might apply it, or where it might be useful to you conceptually, even if you don't necessarily dig in and use it, because these things can be often quite time consuming and complex to build. And so you've got to trade off whether or not the actual process of developing it and keeping track of it and monitoring it all the time is going to be a bigger waste of time than doing it in a different way. I know that over time in my years, particularly in my events time, I tried to use Gantt, but I just found them a bit overkill, and I just found that simple timelines were much more effective for me. But anyway, so here's our PERT network, and the process here, so these two diagrams work together. The example that they give is building a house. You might think of the development of say a festival or an event or a series of events, or the production of a release as being a similar kind of thing that we can map across this idea. So the idea here is that you work out all the steps that you're going to need to take. So if you think about building a house, you're going to need to get your designs approved and your planning permits done. You're going to need to do all the excavation of the site. Then you've got to pour the foundations and all that sort of stuff, etc., etc. Going through to the actual final finishing of the house and handing over the keys. Again, if you're releasing an album, you might start to think of, all right, we've got to write the songs, we've got to do the arrangements, we've got to book the studio, we've got to do the recordings, mastering, blah, 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 blah. And so then you design this sequence, you give each one alphabetical code, you work out how long it's going to take each of these activities, and then if any of the activities link to each other. So, you know, obviously we can't do our mastering of our album until we've recorded it, right? So if mastering was event C, then we would put that recording, which we had as event B, as a contingency preceding activity. So we can't actually do the mastering unless the recording is done. And so we then start to develop this sequence of activities where things build from each other. And then we have these factors where we start to see that things rely on each other. So in this case, we've got items G, which is to shingle the roof, and items F, which is installing the windows, being dependent on the house frame being completed. And so we can't actually do these things until those things are done. And then item H, which is the bricks and siding, have to be done, etc., etc. But we have these things that can happen in parallel as well, right? So these things like the roof and the windows can be done at the same time as these installing the electricals and the insulation, etc., etc. So we start to be able to then develop parallel plans. So in the case where we're talking about, say, a festival, it could be that we need to get our site planning permits in order to create our site operational plans, in order to design our AV requirements. But then we might also need the AV requirements from the acts, which means that we need to secure our acts in order to know what the AV requirements are, alongside of what our site operations might look, our site setup might look like, in order to bring those things together to be able to determine our AV requirements to go on, etc., etc. So again, very complex way of looking at planning that tends to be much more required if you are managing very, very big projects that have a lot of dependencies on each other. But in most cases, you're probably not going to need anything quite as hardcore as this. And then generally speaking, we also want to be thinking about, when it comes to planning, like we've been talking about, this balance between being able to decide where we want to go and what we want to do, but also not be too locked in, particularly in environments that are more volatile or subject to change. And so we've looked at some of these tools before, both in entrepreneurship and in our external environment module, where we looked at our external and our broader environment. And so being able to scan our environment and have an awareness of what is going on in our environment is important to us in terms of being able to plan well and to be able to adjust our plans based on emerging trends. And so also being able to be aware of what our competitors are doing, both so that we can be sure that we're not, that if we're competing with them, that we're kind of competing on the basis of the values that our customers care about, and being able to adjust if that changes, but also to be able to learn from our competitors. So we used a tool that we could consider a tool for competitive intelligence and benchmarking in our entrepreneurship unit, where we did the Blue Ocean strategy. And if you remember that technique that we used, what we did was we mapped out who our immediate competitors were. And then we looked at the factors that they were creating value around. So just to kind of refresh your memory and give you an example, if we were, say, going to be looking at a festival, so my recollection was that Issei, for her jazz and blues festival, or her New Orleans type festival, some of her one of her main competitors was the Byron Blues Festival. And so then she was looking at what were some of the competitive factors that we then benchmarked by giving values to. So it was things like price, the performers, the experience on site, so the kind of vibe in the festival, the camping quality, that sort of stuff. And then we benchmark by giving a score out of 10 for how much the audience valued those particular factors and how good they were at it. So, so with Blues Festival being able to attract really big names, you know, we might give them 10 out of 10 for the artists, performers that they can attract. And compared to us, we can only attract ones that we might give 6 out of 10. Then in terms of price, being a much more expensive festival, we might give them 5 out of 10, but our value for money, we might give 8 out of 10. And so this gives us a way of benchmarking and getting the competitive intelligence around what is it that our competitors are doing, and what is the value that we're competing with them on? How are they doing it, and what are they doing well, and how might we learn from that to improve what we're doing?